Hey, welcome back to this intermediate JavaScript tutorial series. Today we'll be talking about closures and IIFEs, aka IIFEs. So let's get to it. Alright, and as always, all of the material for this episode will be available on my GitHub. I will put a link in the description for that. We're in this third folder, IIFE functions. So when we first load this up, we see a basic example of an IIFE, which stands for immediately invoked function expression. Essentially what's happening is we're wrapping a function in parentheses and including these parentheses to actually invoke it. Now, there's actually a number of different ways that you can do this, and we'll cover that in a bit. But what is it? Well, it's essentially where we define and execute the statements without cluttering up the global namespace. You're also able to return values as needed, which is what a closure is, and it gives you the ability to hide your privates. You're able to hide your private variables. So if you look at the console, we see this is a message from an IIFE, type of message variable, undefined. Well, for a little more context, let's look at the code. And here we find this basic IIFE, where we're creating this constant message. This is a message from an IIFE, and then we're logging it. After that, we're trying to access this message with the type of, and it's undefined. And that shows that this message is scoped inside of that IIFE. Now, if we scroll down, we see a little more robust example of an IIFE with all the bells and whistles. The first thing you'll note is instead of a standard function, I'm actually including an arrow function. I'm also including arguments. If we scroll down just a bit to the bottom of it, you'll see that I'm passing a starting value to it, which is then referenced as SV inside of that function. We're using that to define the private count. So if nothing is passed, it'll be 0. Otherwise, it'll be that starting value. We're then defining a few attributes. Has changed count, public object, which includes a has changed count, more on that in a bit, and then some functions, get count and increment. Get count obviously is just returning this private count, and increment is incrementing not just the private count, but also the counter, so we can track how many times that private count has changed. Down at the bottom, we have our return statement, where we are returning an object which includes the get count, has changed count, increment, and public object. Now, this might look like just a bunch of random code, so let's play with it a little bit and see if we can make it a little easier to understand. If we run play with counter, we're logging out first our counter.privateCount, which is undefined, and that's what we would expect because we didn't actually return it. If we use getCount, which is the method that we did return, we find that it gives us access to that private count, 5, and then we run increment a few times, 6, 7, 8. Now, something that's worth keeping in mind, and this has to do with how object types are passed, which I covered in another video on types. I don't know if I can figure out how to put it up in the card thing on YouTube. I'll try and do that. Otherwise, I'll just put a link in the description to that video. But essentially what's happening is when we try looking at this counter, the number hasn't changed, 0. Whereas when we look at the object, has changed count is 3. So what's going on? Well, if we look at this function again, we see we're defining variables both as primitives, here being a 0, a number, and object types. So here we have an object. Same thing, functions are treated as objects. And then when we return, based on the type, we're returning either its literal value or a reference to it. So getCount being a function, we're passing a reference to that function. Has changed count, we're just returning the literal value, which means we're returning 0. And that actually is now separate from this variable has changed count. On the other hand, when we return public object, we're returning a reference to that object, so we still have access to that. Same thing goes for increment. We have a function, so we're returning a reference to that. Now, if you can wrap your head around this, that means you already understand closures. A closure is just a way of giving access to a function scope from a function or an object inside of it. That means when that function has already been invoked and is no longer accessible through another variable, we still have access to its internals via those objects or functions that we've returned. The use of IIFEs and closures are extremely powerful when writing a library. Why? Well, you might not want to give access to all of the variables you use in your library to third parties that are using it. You now have a way of actually containing private variables within that scope, and you can decide to which variables someone using your library has access. Like I write here, IIFEs are great for self-contained libraries. They run right away, they don't clutter the namespace, and they protect what they want. They make available what they want to make available. So I thought what would be a good idea is taking this silly little library that's currently written in the global space and turning this into an IIFE and then a closure and making it maybe a little more powerful. So what it does now is it takes all of the nodes with the class hoverMe, and then for each of those, we're marking what its original color is. And when you mouse over it, it makes that color gray. And when you stop hovering over it, puts it back to the original color. So we see that at the bottom here. If we're hovering over this text, hoverMe, turns gray. Same thing with this blue text, which has that class, but this text does not. And therefore, when we're hovering over it, just like every other paragraph and element on this page, it's not changing the color. Great, so let's follow this checklist. Make this an IIFE function. Well, that part's easy. Inside of these parentheses, we can say function, and that can be an arrow function as well. And then you have two options. You can put parentheses on the outside or the inside, and it pretty much does the same thing. I think semantically it's the difference between defining this function and then running it, or just containing the definition and running of that function. So it doesn't really make a difference. Now I should note, alternatively, you could get rid of that. And just because of how the syntax is parsed in JavaScript, you can use a few different symbols to make this work. So you could say, I believe, plus, and that'll work. You could say minus. I think you can say tilde, and I think one other. It doesn't matter. Generally, the main thing that people are going to use is either the function and these final brackets, either inside or outside of the parentheses. Anyways, let's take all of this functionality here, paste it in here, save it up, and run it. Does it still work? Yes. How can we test that our IIFE has successfully protected scope? Well, this const hover elements, if we copy that, there's no reference to it. So that works. Great. Next, make it a closure. Well, that's easy. All we're going to do is say const hoverMe, and there we go. So we save that up, run it, hoverMe. Now, the console is actually recommending hoverMe, but it's undefined. Why is that? Well, as you remember, we give access based on what we return. Just like if you invoke any function, the default return is undefined. So if we just return this empty object, hoverMe is now that empty object. So what do we want to do? Track how many times a color is changed. And that should be pretty easy. Let's just say let color change counter equals 0. And then every time the color is changing to gray, let's say color change counter plus equals 1. And we will do the same in mouse out. Now, before I do that, this could be a good example of using a private method, where instead of doing the same functionality in two different places, we should do what any good programmer does, and that's avoid repeating yourself. There's the common term dry, do not repeat yourself. So what we're going to do is we're going to say const increment color counter and create this arrow function that does that. Now, obviously in this case, it ends up being more lines of code than just saying color change your counter plus 1. But the principle behind it is that you never know if you want to end up doing more things in the future and keep track, or maybe events that take place when this color counter is incremented. And so this just gives us more flexibility. And we'll also be able to demonstrate how this is now going to be kept private when we don't return it. The last thing we need to do is now create a function that gives us access to this color changer counter, which is pretty easy. we'll just say const color change counter, returned right away. To now make that accessible, color changes. And note that I'm returning, in this case, the reference to the function, and I'm not returning a value. Now, one thing that I've been doing here that is probably at least worth bringing up is putting the name of the variable in the return statement and then a comma. But this is actually shorthand for saying color changes, color changes. So, for example, I could make this CC and return this color changes and then access it through hoverme.cc. And you don't even know what the name of that function is inside. But since I don't really care to hide that, I'll just be returning color changes, which keeps the name the same. So the last thing I have to do is add that in this event listener. So we'll say increment color counter, increment color counter. So now let's say color changes 0. Now hovering on is 1, off is 2, and as we expect, 2 to 3 to 4. So I hope what you can take away from this is that the use of IIFEs and closures is a great way to organize independent functionalities across a web application. I worked on a team, for example, where each page was its own IIFE, and you could import and export different page functionalities to other pages based on the need, while keeping all of the private functionality enclosed within that IIFE. So it's an extremely powerful tool that with just a little bit of practice isn't too difficult to get the hang of. So if you liked the video, if you got something useful out of it, feel free to drop a like, subscribe for more content like this, and leave a comment if you learned something new, which helps grow the channel. All right, take care.